Hi there, this is Dr. Golding again. I hope you're doing well. And we're going to continue our class on John Stuart Mill and his theory of utilitarianism. Now, toward the end of last class, I mentioned that there is a kind of an argument that Mill gives for the principle of utility, even though he says that in a way it's impossible to prove the principle of utility, because he believes that it's impossible to prove that some end should be the ultimate goal or end of our behavior. So I'm going to go through the argument that he gives, despite the disclaimer that he thinks the argument really doesn't work in a sense, yet he gives an argument. And again, I mentioned that this argument is found toward the very end of the editor's introduction to the chapter, which has a selection from Mill's own writing. So that very last paragraph in the editor's introduction to the chapter is itself taken from Mill himself. And so what I've done here is I've put on the board in a series of 6 steps the argument that Mill gives to try to support the principle of utility. Now, just to refresh our memory, the principle of utility is, according to Mill, the fundamental moral principle. It is the principle that says we ought morally always to do that action which, of all of our available options, is the action that will promote the greatest amount of happiness in society at large. What's morally right is that action which promotes happiness in society at large. Another way of putting it is that what's moral is maximizing social happiness. So the principle of utility here is going to be the conclusion of this argument, which I've represented in 5 steps. Now, I'm going to go through each of these steps and talk about each one and maybe elaborate on each step and try to explain why Mill thinks that this is in some way a reasonable argument for his principle of utility. And we'll see after we go through it, there's going to be several criticisms that we're going to talk about, and maybe for some of them we'll discuss ways in which Mill might try to answer those criticisms. Again, we have to take the argument with a grain of salt, so to speak, because Mill himself has told us that you really can't give an argument for an ultimate end. So anyway, let's get to the argument. Mill begins with a statement about visibility, and he also mentions in the text, he says the same thing for audibility. What does this mean? So the first step is the only way to prove that something is visible is to show that people do in fact see it. He says the same thing about audible. The only way to show that something is audible, hearable, is to show that people do in fact hear it. So just for example, let's suppose some scientist claims that a certain planet, which no one believes in, is actually visible in the sky. So if he's claiming that the planet is visible and everybody looks up there and they can't actually see it, they can never see it, then we would say, well, you're saying that it's visible, but prove that it's visible. Well, the only way to prove that some planet is visible in the sky is to produce an actual sighting of the planet. Okay, so it might be through a telescope, it might be only at a certain time of the year when this planet is visible, but the only way to prove that some entity or thing is visible, capable of being seen, is to show that people do in fact see it. And the same thing goes for audible. The only way to show that something is audible, maybe there's some scientist who claims that there's certain sounds coming from outer space. Well, the only way to prove that these sounds are actually hearable, audible, is to produce an actual case where someone actually hears the sound, and then we can say, okay, well, you proved that it was hearable because someone actually heard it. All right, so that is step number one. The only way to prove that something is visible is to show that people do, in fact, see it. Now, the second step, in a way, it seems, is that Mill is arguing by analogy, that just as what is true about visible, the same thing that's true about visibility is also true about desirability. The only way, let's read number 2 together, the only way to prove that some end or goal is desirable is to show that people do in fact desire it. Okay? Works the same way as visible. Visible, audible, desirable should work the same way. The only way to prove that some end or goal is desirable, capable of being desired, is to show that people do in fact desire it. So that is step number 2. Now the next step, step 3, really represents what we might call psychological eudaimonism. If you remember, we had this term when we studied Aristotle, that Mill believes that each individual desires their own happiness. We are psychologically driven to pursue our own happiness, and in fact, what I have up on the board here is a little bit weak, meaning by that actually Mill believes something stronger. It's not just that we all desire our own happiness, it's that everything we do is ultimately done out of a desire for happiness. Now remember, I'm just going to refresh your memory that according to Mill, happiness has to do with pleasure. Pleasure, whether it's mental or physical. We talked about the 2 kinds of pleasure. So I'm not going to go over all that again, but just keep that in your mind, that according to Mill, happiness has to do, it is the same thing as pleasure, mental pleasure, and physical pleasure. Certain pleasures are higher, certain pleasures are lower, certain pleasures, involve the mind, and certain pleasures involve more of the body, and the ones that involve the mind are superior in their quality of pleasure to the pleasures that involve the body. But that's not so important, that whole distinction right now. Mill here is claiming in number 3 that we desire, each and every one of us, whatever we do it because we want to attain some kind of pleasure or avoid some kind of pain. Everything we do is driven by a desire for our own happiness. Okay, that's what step 3 says. Therefore, now Mill argues, now step 3 does not follow from 1 and 2. Okay, step 2 does seem to follow from 1, at least that's what Mill claims, that if you believe in step 1, you should believe in step 2. Step 3 is what we would call an independent premise. He thinks this is just a truth about human nature, that everything we do for the sake of our own happiness. Now Mill argues as follows. It seems like this is what he's arguing, that from 3, we can derive number 4. That if you take society as a whole, what is society as a whole? What does that mean? Society is a collection of the individual members of society, right? A society is made up of those individuals who are grouped together somehow, maybe in their location or in their interactions, right? So a society is a group of individuals, a set of individuals that have interactions. Usually they would live in proximity to one another. Okay, so a society is a group of members made up of individuals. Now, if each individual desires his or her own happiness, then society as a whole, putting them all together, what does society as a whole desire? It desires social happiness. social or collective happiness. Society as a whole desires the happiness of the greatest number, or we should say the greatest happiness of the greatest number. That's what society as a whole, as a group, desires. Okay, because society is made up of individuals that desire their happiness, so putting them all together, society as a whole desires collective or social happiness. That is step 4. And now we move to step 5. Now, step 5 is essentially putting together step 4 with step 2. Okay? We said before the only way to show that some end is desirable is to show that people do in fact desire it. Well, social happiness is the only desirable end for society as a whole, because that is in fact what society desires. Okay, let me just say this again. Step 4 is saying, society as a whole, what do we in fact desire as a group? As a group, the only thing that we desire as a group is social happiness. We desire the happiness of the greatest number, or the maximum amount of happiness that we as a society can attain. So society, in fact, desires social happiness, and the only way to prove that something is desirable is to show that people do, in fact, desire it. So here we have step 5. Again, I'm saying that step 5 is a result of putting together, logically, step 2 with step 4. Social happiness is the only desirable end for society as a whole. Excuse me. Now, based on step 5, the only desirable end, the only end that is worthy of our pursuit as a general group, as a society, is social happiness. Therefore, the principle of utility follows. It follows that that's what we should do. That's the only desirable end for society as a whole. Therefore, that is the only goal that we ought to pursue as a group. And therefore, it follows that what's right for an individual to do is to pursue the desirable end for society as a whole, and that is going to be pursuing social or collective happiness, or the greatest happiness of the greatest number. Okay, now that is a summary of the argument in a series of steps as Mill would have it. Now again, we should bear in mind that Mill said, in a way, it's impossible to prove that there is an ultimate goal that society should have. You can prove what people do want, all right? He thinks that each individual definitely desires his or her own happiness. That's a fact. And his claim is that as an ultimate end for society as a whole, the only way we can the only end that would be desirable as for us as a group is social happiness. Okay, now let's talk about some criticisms against this argument. So we're moving now to criticisms against the argument. And what I'm going to talk about is, I would say 3, my favorite number, 3 criticisms against the argument that we have on the board. I want to leave the argument up on the board so we can look at it, but if you want to take some notes, that might be a good idea. We're going to go into 3 criticisms against this argument. And there might be more, all right, but I'll just talk about 3 criticisms. So, first of all, we have one way of criticizing the argument is to actually deny number 3. Okay, if you believe that some people do, or maybe even all people can and sometimes do things that are not in their own happiness, that people can be driven by a motivation other than the pursuit of happiness, then you would disagree with number 3. You might point to, for example, heroic action as an example, or self-sacrificial action. We've talked about this before. It seems that there are some cases of genuine altruism, that there are some individuals, at least sometime in their lifetime, where they do something and they know they're doing it and they give up their own happiness for the sake of somebody else, then you would disagree with number 3. Okay? So that's one way of criticizing the argument, is to deny premise number 3. But there's some other criticisms, 2 other criticisms with regard to this argument. Many philosophers think that Mill has made a very fundamental logical error here in moving from step 3 to step 4. And this actually looks like what is sometimes called, and I'm going to give you a technical term for this, this is sometimes called the fallacy of composition. I think I'll write this on the board. I'm going to write it right in here. Fallacy of composition. Okay, this applies to Mill's attempt to move from 3 to 4. I hope you can see that. Now, what is a fallacy? F-A-L-L-A-C-Y. A fallacy is a logical mistake of some sort. When someone makes a faulty inference. So philosophers sometimes have names for certain kinds of fallacies, mistakes that sometimes people make in logical reasoning, or attempts to be logical in their reasoning. Now, the fallacy of composition, that says composition, the fallacy of composition is a particular kind of error that some people make in their thinking. Now, listen very carefully to what the fallacy of composition involves, and I'll give you a very simple example where it's obvious that someone is making or committing the fallacy of composition. The fallacy of composition occurs when a person mistakenly infers from the fact that each member of a group has a certain property to the conclusion that the entire group or set has that same property. Okay, I'll say that again more slowly. If you want to turn the video off and try to write this down, that would be great. Fallacy of composition occurs when a person mistakenly infers from the fact that each member of a group has a certain property to the conclusion, the mistaken conclusion, that the entire group or set somehow has that same property. Now, I'm going to give you an example where you would see that that is obviously a wrong, bad thing to do. Okay, so take, for example, I'm going to give you a little mathematical example. It's a very simple mathematical example. Suppose you have the following set: 2, 4, and 6. Okay, that's the set of numbers 2, 4, and 6. Okay, now suppose somebody said the following. Suppose somebody said, look, each member of that set is even, right? 2 is even, 4 is even, 6 is even, right? Suppose somebody said, well, because each member of the set is even, therefore the entire set is also an even numbered set. Well, wait a second. This actually is an odd numbered set, right? There are 3 members of this set. So the set as a whole has an odd number. Even though each individual member of the set is even, the set as a whole is odd. It's odd numbered, right? It's also odd in the sense that it's weird. You have a set made of even numbers, even though the set as a whole has 3 members, which is odd. Okay, well, it's not that odd, right? This is the way the world works. Sometimes what is true of each individual member is not necessarily true of the entire set. So that is called, if someone were to make that inference, bad inference, that would be called, you're committing the fallacy of composition. It's called composition because you're putting together without thinking that sometimes composition doesn't work, okay? I'll give you another example. I'm not going to put this one on the board, but I'll give you another example of a fallacy of composition. Suppose somebody infers from the fact that each and every atom in my car, let's say, each and every atom, A-T-O-M, each and every atom in my car weighs less than a pound, right? Each and every atom in my car weighs less than a pound. Therefore, my entire car weighs less than a pound. Obviously, that's false. Although each and every part of my car or each and every atom in my car may weigh less than a pound, when you put them all together, right, they weigh more than a pound, right? My car weighs a lot more than a pound. Because what's true of the whole is not necessarily true of the parts. That's, in a way, the same thing as saying what the fallacy of composition is. Now, I just want to point out that there are some cases where composition does work. I'll give you what I mean by that is, consider the following example. Suppose I were to say each and every patch, each and every square inch on this wall is beige or white, off-white. Each and every square inch on this wall is white. Therefore, the entire wall is white. So that would be true, right? So, in other words, sometimes it works. If each and every square inch of my wall is white, then it would have to be the case that the whole wall is white. So sometimes what's true of the part is true of the whole, and sometimes what's true of the part is not true of the whole. Okay, so let's go back to talk about Mill's argument. He was arguing that based on 3, we can get to 4. If each individual desires his or her happiness, then society as a whole desires social happiness? No. Fallacy of composition. Again, this is what some philosophers have claimed. Mill has committed a fallacy. He's committed the fallacy of composition. Just because each individual desires happiness, his own happiness, or their own happiness, it does not follow that this group, this collective, desires collective happiness. In fact, one could argue that it seems that some people don't desire other people's happinesses, right? I mean, that seems to be a fact. I don't necessarily desire the happiness of my neighbor. Maybe it would be nice to do, maybe it's the right thing to do, but just from the fact that each individual desires his happiness or her happiness, it does not follow that society as a whole desires social or collective happiness. Okay, so that's criticism number 2. Mill commits the fallacy of composition when he tries to go from step 3 to step 4. And now for a third criticism, let's focus on 1 and 2, okay? Mill makes an analogy between visible and desirable, right? He makes an analogy between visible and desirable. Now, the fact is that the word visible means basically one thing. The word visible means capable of being seen, right? Visible means can be seen. However, the word desirable means two very different things depending upon the context. The word desirable is ambiguous. It can mean two different things. The word desirable sometimes means capable of being desired. Okay? If something is desirable, that means it can be desired. So in that sense, we could say that alcohol is desirable. People do in fact desire to drink alcohol. We could say chocolate is desirable. We could say, we could even say theft, robbery is desirable because it is something that can be desired, right? There are people who do in fact desire to steal. So in the sense of can be desired, theft is desirable, can be desired. Now, if we use the word desirable to mean can be desired, then it is analogous to visible. Okay, but there's another meaning of the word desirable. The word desirable often in English means worthy of being desired. As for example, when someone says to you, maybe your mother, or maybe someone who is trying to give you advice, might say something like, that behavior is not desirable. Okay, suppose you're staying out late at night and you're drinking, you're coming home at 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning, and your mother says to you, your behavior is not desirable. So in that sense of the word desirable, it means worthy of being desired. Not just that you can desire, because obviously in sense number one, it is possible to desire to stay out late at night partying and coming home at 3 in the morning. That is a thing that can be desired, but it's not something that is worthy of being desired or something that you should desire. Or at least when your mother or whoever's in charge says this is undesirable behavior, they don't mean that you can't possibly desire it. They mean that somehow you shouldn't. They're making a moral judgment. So the point is that the word desirable has two meanings. Sometimes it means can be desired. In that sense, it's analogous to visible. On the other hand, sometimes the word desirable means worthy morally of being desired. And in that sense, it is not analogous to visible, because visible doesn't mean worthy of being seen, it means can be seen. So what's going on? When Mill makes this analogy over here, he must be using the word desirable in a non-moral sense, right? If we're going to say that visible and desirable are analogous, then we have to be using the word desirable in a non-moral sense. All it means is can be desired. Okay, let's suppose that's true. Let's suppose Mill, when he uses the word desirable over here, he's using it in a non-moral sense. The problem is that when he gets to step 5, and he says over here, social happiness is the only desirable end for society as a whole, he wants to use this, Mill wants to use step 5 to make a moral claim. The principle of utility is a moral statement. The principle of utility says that, that what people ought to do, what's worthy, what they should do, is promote social happiness. Now, the principle of utility is not going to follow from 5 if this is only being used in a non-moral sense. Okay? If this is saying that's what people want, therefore that's what they should want, it doesn't follow. If desirable is being used in a non-moral sense over here, then the principle of utility does not follow from step 5. So, we have what is called, I'm going to put this on the board, this is called Another fallacy, this is called the fallacy of ambiguity. The fallacy of ambiguity. We all know what it is that certain words are ambiguous. Certain words mean more than one thing. Okay, we can deal with that. However, what is not logically fair, what is not logically correct, is to use a word in one meaning at the beginning of an argument and then somehow switch to using that same term in a different sense. And it looks like Mill has committed the fallacy of ambiguity, meaning by that he starts off using a term, in this case it's the word desirable. Over here he's using the word desirable to mean can be desired. Yet over here when he gets to step 5 and is trying to infer the principle of utility from step 5, he's using the word desirable in a moral sense. So he switched the meanings of terms in the middle of an argument, and that is called the fallacy of ambiguity. Imagine what crazy things you'd be able to prove if you start off using a word in one sense, and then you continue, and then you use the word in a completely different sense to infer something based on your premises. Okay? So that's called the fallacy of ambiguity, and it looks like Mill has committed the fallacy of ambiguity. Now, that criticism is a little bit subtle, and if you need to play the video a little bit over again to go through that criticism, I wouldn't be surprised. But let's talk a little bit about how Mill might respond to at least some of these criticisms. Again, we have to go back to what I said before, that Mill has told us you really can't prove the principle of utility. According to Mill, there's no way of proving any ultimate end that society ought to have. Either they're going to do it, either they're going to adopt it, or they're not. You can never really truly argue somebody or even a group of people into thinking that here's some goal that you should pursue, because you can only argue about facts. You can only demonstrate facts. You can't demonstrate claims about what people ought to do. Okay? Of course, for someone like Aristotle, who believes in teleology, for Aquinas, who believes in teleology, in a way they would say, no, you're wrong. Someone who believes in teleology believes that there is an ultimate goal or a purpose which we somehow ought to strive for, even though it might not be something that we actually do in fact strive for. Okay? So in a way, a lot of this Mill's view is driven by a denial of teleology. But let's try to think about what Mill might say in response to the two last criticisms I gave, the one about ambiguity and the one about the fallacy of composition. I think Mill might say something like this. He might say, what is morality? Let's think about this. What is morality all about? From Mill's point of view, morality is a system or let's call it a construct. Morality is some kind of a social tool that humans use to judge the actions of the members of that society, okay? In any given society, when people say that's wrong or they say that's right, what is the function of a moral judgment? When I say, don't do that, or that's wrong, or if I say, that's right, that's good, that is something that is good to do. So Mill is going to say that morality is a tool that society uses to judge the actions of its members. Society has as a whole, society has some idea about how they're going to judge the behavior of the actions of the members of society. Okay, now Mill says, what is going to be the criterion by which society judges the actions of its members? How is society going to make that decision about judging the actions of its members? So Mill says like this, the only thing we have to make that judgment reasonably is social happiness. There's nothing else we can fall back upon, so to speak, especially if we don't believe in teleology, and if we don't believe, let's say, in God, or we don't think necessarily that there is a God, or that God has issued commandments, or that there's something like that. If we place all that outside our realm of what we believe in, okay, well, how are we going to judge the actions of society? How is society going to judge the actions of its members? Well, the only reasonable principle is the principle of utility. That's all we got. It's kind of like, what I'm saying is that in a way, Mill thinks that, to use a cliche, this is the only game in town. What else are we going to rely upon as a group to judge the actions of individual members of society, other than, does it make more people more happy? Because now he believes in number 3 for sure. Everything that I do for the sake of my happiness. And so therefore, as a group, even if it doesn't follow logically that somehow we all do desire everybody's happiness, okay, so really there is a fallacy of composition here. It doesn't follow that this is what society in fact desires. But if we're going to have some standard by which to judge the actions of individual members with respect to society as a whole, then the only reasonable principle to use is going to be the principle of utility. What maximizes happiness and what doesn't? Even though there really is no true, genuine proof that that's what we should do, it is, so to speak, the only game in town when it comes to how society is going to make moral decisions. Now, okay, I've said a little bit about what I think Mill would say in response to some of these criticisms, and you can think about whether that's a good response or not. I'd like to talk about a couple other aspects of Mill's theory that we haven't yet got to, and also discuss a little bit the question of, is Mill a universalist or a relativist? Okay, does he believe that there is some kind of universal truth to what is morally correct for all societies? Or does he believe that morality can change from time to time and from place to place? So let me erase the board here for a minute. And first we have to talk about, before we get into that question, one really very important topic that we still need to talk about is the question of moral motivation. According to Mill, why should a person behave morally? So let's erase the board, get this out of the way. We're going to continue for a little more here. And if you're doing your paper on Mill, this would be something to incorporate into the paper for sure. What we're talking about now is the question of, we've called it before, the question or the issue of moral motivation. Moral motivation. And what I mean by that as a question is, in this case, according to Mill, what is the motivation for people to behave morally? Mill is claiming that the principle of utility is the fundamental moral principle. We should always seek to maximize the happiness of the greatest number. We should always act in such a way as to do that action which will promote the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Why? What's the motivation for someone to do that? Okay, so Mill talks about two motivations. So we have a little double motivation theory going on here, if you remember that phrase. Mill talks about, he calls the one motivation is called the external sanction. And one motivation is called the internal sanction. Okay, now I'll explain briefly what these mean. Let's talk about the external sanction first. Mill thinks that over time, society has, as a group, developed certain sanctions. Now, a sanction is kind of like a penalty or a reward for doing something. Okay, that's what we mean here by a sanction. To issue a sanction, the term sanction often has kind of like a negative connotation of, I'm hitting you with sanctions. Like in the international scene, we talk about how certain countries are placed under sanctions. So basically a sanction is a penalty, but it could also be understood as a reward. There's an external sanction for behaving morally. Now what does that mean? Society over time has developed external sanctions. That is to say, punishments and rewards for moral behavior. That is to say, according to Mill, for people to behave in accord with the principle of utility. So, for example, what's an example of a sanction? Well, prison, fines, the death penalty is a big-time sanction, right? Society has come up with mechanisms for making people, forcing people to be motivated to behave in accord with the principle of utility. So prison, death penalty, fines, other kinds of punishments that the government has instituted, those are external sanctions. Okay, now they're called external sanctions because they're not something that you necessarily, it's not something that you really necessarily want to obey the principle of morality just for its own sake. You're doing it because you're afraid of getting caught, okay? Because, in other words, it's an external to you. There's a punishment that's going to come down upon you, so to speak, from the outside. Now, external sanctions, however, do not only include things like punishments and penalties that the government will give you, but there are also other kinds of sanctions that society over time has created or implemented, such as, for example, sometimes these are called social sanctions. For example, if you are not a nice person, if you behave in a mean and nasty way, then you're going to get a punishment in the sense that people are not going to want to be friendly to you. If you are not a good, kind, friendly neighbor, then other people living around you are not going to be so nice and friendly to you. So that's another kind of external sanction. Okay, if I don't help my neighbor out every so often when they need help, then they're probably not going to want to help me out when I need help. So that's a motive that I have for, let's say, helping my neighbor when he is or she is in distress. All of that goes under the category of external sanctions. So again, the basic idea is that why should you behave morally? Well, there's going to be certain penalties and certain rewards for behaving morally that society is going to place upon you. And again, remember, Mill is thinking, excuse me, that the only motivation that we have for acting at all is what is going to make us happy or unhappy. Excuse me. Okay, so let's talk about the internal sanction now. Mill claims that in addition to the external sanctions, there's also something called the internal sanction. Now, what is this? Mill brings up the concept of sympathy. Or fellow feeling. Fellow feeling. The idea of sympathy is when a person feels somebody else's pain, so to speak, or feels somebody else's pleasure. If I see a child suffering, for example, it's going to make me feel bad. At least a lot of the time. For many people, this is going to be true. If you see somebody suffering, you see somebody in pain, it gives you pain. Maybe not physical pain, but it can give you that feeling of anguish or sadness. If I see somebody else enjoying themselves and having a good time, like imagine you see somebody who is a kid on their birthday, or let's say someone who's about to get married, or some other occasion when they look like they're really, really happy, it makes you happy, or it can make you happy. So fellow feeling or sympathy is a very human phenomenon that occurs, that when we see other people being happy, we feel happy. When we see other people being unhappy, it makes us unhappy. Now, the internal sanction is basically something like that. We can develop a sense of identifying our own happiness with the happiness of society at large. Now, because remember again, according to Mill, the principle of utility is that one should always promote the happiness of society at large. One should always seek to promote the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number out of all of your available options. Okay, it is possible, according to Mill, the human being can, as it were, internalize the principle of utility, and it could become something which for them, their happiness, in fact, their greatest happiness can be tied to, linked with the greatest happiness of society at large, and their greatest unhappiness can be linked or tied to the unhappiness of the greatest number. So in other words, they can literally internalize the principle of utility. Now, according to Mill, that's only going to happen when they identify their own happiness with the happiness of society at large. So for example, I mean, one of the ways in which this can work is, I think, I'll just use the example from today's news. I don't mean today, just literally today, but current events, the virus. A lot of people, even if they're doing okay, it's so depressing. It's so distressing to read the news and read about all the people who are sick and all the people who have lost their jobs and all the people who are alone and can't be treated properly and on without going into all the details. The point is that an individual human being has the capacity to sort of internalize a sense of identifying his or her own happiness with the happiness of everybody in society and maybe even the happiness of everybody in the world. Okay, if I know that there are numbers and numbers of children starving in some foreign country, that's going to make me feel bad. And I'm going to hopefully be motivated to do something to help those people. Maybe write a check, send a donation, do something for those starving people across on some other side of the world. But the point is here that human beings have the ability to do this, to internalize a sense of the principle of utility into their own behavior. And that's something that's going to be operative even when there's no external sanction. Okay, so again, the difference between the external sanction and the internal sanction is the external sanction is there's some punishment hanging over you, or there's some reward that's going to come from the outside, as it were, and is going to reward you for behaving morally, make you happier for behaving morally, or is going to make you unhappy if you cause unhappiness to somebody else. That's the external sanction. The internal sanction is going to be there, Mill says, even when the external sanction is not. Okay, so even though no one is necessarily threatening me or forcing me to send a donation, let's say, to a charity, from the internal sanction, I could very well be motivated to somehow, make a donation or do the right thing, do that thing, which of all available options would make more people more happy than otherwise. Now, one of the questions we could ask is, it seems like Mill is right that there are people who do have this internal sanction. There are plenty of people who don't seem to have this internal sanction, right? And so, is there any way that Mill could argue that somehow this is what people should have in them, that they should have this internal sanction, that they should have this? Well, he thinks that they should, but it's not at all clear how he could possibly argue that people who don't have this motivation somehow should have it. Okay, somehow he thinks that the mental pleasure, okay, going back to this point about mental pleasure and mental anguish, Mill thinks that there's a certain kind of very, very elevated, very refined, very wonderful, delicious pleasure that a person can cultivate in doing moral actions. Okay, because they're going to somehow feel this great internal. Now it's not going to be a physical pleasure, right? It's going to be a mental pleasure. There's going to be some kind of great, deep mental pleasure in recognizing that what I care about is not just myself, my own happiness, but I care about other people as well. I care about the happiness of everybody in society. And when I act in such a way that is going to make me truly, truly feel that internal mental pleasure and avoid feeling the mental pain at contemplating the unhappiness of the greatest number. Okay, so I've tried to explain the external sanction and the internal sanction. I'd like to spend a little time now talking about whether Mill is a universalist or a relativist. Is Mill a universalist? Let's put this question on the board. Is Mill a universalist or a relativist? Does Mill believe that there is a single moral rule that applies to all societies at all times? Or does he believe that morality is relative and changes from time to time and from place to place? So the simple answer to this question is he's a universalist about the principle of utility, but he's a relativist about the secondary moral rules. So let's go back to that distinction which we talked about last time, a couple times ago. Remember that Mill believes that the principle of utility is the fundamental moral principle, the principle which underlies or should underlie morality. He thinks that that should be true in all societies. Now, there are many societies, Mill would admit, there are many societies that don't follow the principle of utility. There are some societies in which they believe that, I don't know, I guess what's moral could be enslaving people, killing people, who knows what. There are societies where it's believed that's what is right to do is based on the Bible or the Quran or some other religious text. Okay, so Mill would agree that there are societies out there that don't follow the principle of utility. But he would say that they're wrong. Every society ought to follow the fundamental rule of always do that action which promotes the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Now, on the other hand, the secondary moral rules, well, that can change from time to time and from place to place. Remember, the secondary moral rules are those so-called rules of thumb, which in general tell us what actions make more people more happy more of the time. Now, when it comes to something like murder, killing, stealing, maiming people, those things should be pretty much universal. They should be, because in almost any society, killing and stealing and cheating and maiming is going to be something that makes more people more unhappy more of the time. But then there are going to be some things that could easily change. There could be various rules about, let's say, how we treat the aging, how we treat the unborn, how we treat children. There could be all sorts of rules and regulations about dress code. In some societies, they don't want to see anybody who is not fully clad. And in some societies, it's regarded as, no, we want people to be more free in how they dress. And there shouldn't be, it doesn't make us unhappy. In fact, it makes us maybe more happy to see people walking around with less clothes or less clad. So the point is that those kinds of things can change from society to society and from place to place. What makes one group of people more happy more of the time could be different than what makes a different society more happy more of the time. So the secondary moral rules could theoretically change from place to place. The fundamental principle of utility should not change. All societies ought to use the principle of utility to judge the moral worth of the actions of their members, but what in fact turns out to be right or wrong in a given society could change from time to time and from place to place. So I hope I've explained that well enough for today. We've gone on for about an hour, and so I'm going to have to stop here. And I think what we're going to do is we're going to have one more class on Mill after this.